Well, I've been in the conference room there at Butler many times, and I know what it's like to be there, and I'm sure I know many of the people who are attending today. So hello to everybody. It's in the high 70s here and pretty good weather. I guess it's also quite good out there. I'm going to be talking to you today about values and worldviews for an ecological civilization. To do that in 30 minutes is a tall order. I'll take this on by speaking to you about some of the elements of this that are most important to me. I only have one slide, so you'll see that later. I want to begin by saying I've been greatly influenced by the work of Thomas Berry. There are very different understandings of what an ecological civilization would be. In sustainability, some talk about the approaches of the three Sachs. The first is Wolfgang Sachs of the Wuppertal Institute in Germany. He's written books like Planetary Dialectics and Fair Future. He's a critic of both conventional development and conventional sustainable development. The second is Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. He is a trained macroeconomist who was an important advisor to Russia and other former states of the Soviet Union on privatization and the development of market economies after the end of the Cold War. He now is leader of the Earth Institute at Columbia University and is perhaps the most prominent leader in conventional sustainable development. He advocates applying all of the capacities of the industrial economy to eradicate poverty and realize justice and sustainability. The third, if you can guess, is Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs, of course, is not an individual. It's a global investment bank and represents conventional development, capital markets, and globalization. Thomas Berry is of the Wolfgang Sachs variety, or maybe better, one could say that Wolfgang Sachs is of the Thomas Berry variety. Berry wrote three key books: The Dream of the Earth, The Universe Story, co-authored with Brian Swelm, and the great work, Our Way into the Future. I highly recommend them to you. I spend some time on the three Sachs and on Thomas Berry because one's values for an ecological civilization depend in part on where one is coming from. All of the Sachs have a role to play in this transition, and I'm involved in all three, as in a way all of us are. But my dominant orientation is based on the Wolfgang Sachs Thomas Berry view. This is the view that if we are to have a viable human future and a flourishing Earth community, fundamental change is needed that goes beyond reforming our present industrial civilization. Rather than taking a problem-solution approach, it takes a breakdown, breakthrough approach. There are two other great influences on my thinking. The first is Alfred North Whitehead. He was a philosopher, and his philosophy is popularly known as process philosophy, though he described it as organic philosophy. An organism is a living being. All of its component parts are related and work together. An organism is alive, has experiences, is moved by feelings, and has intentions. Whitehead wrote that the whole universe should be understood by analogy to living organisms. At the broadest reach, the universe as a whole is organic, and within this are many societies, each of which functions organically. At the bottom of the universe, Whitehead wrote, there are minute events, which are more like experiences or bursts of energy than hard objects. Like pixels on a TV screen, the universe is perpetually refreshing itself through these minute events, and all together they are creating and recreating the world we know. I like to think of the universe developing like a grand symphony with zillions of related notes being played. The second of this group is E. Maynard Adams, who was chair of the philosophy department here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. From the time of Descartes, there has been a split between human capacities to think, imagine, and experience, and nature as inert matter, mechanistically developing solely by reason of antecedent cause and effect relationships. Adams called the latter scientific naturalism, which he considered the dominant modern worldview, one which eliminated value and meaning concepts from the descriptive and explanatory framework of the universe. Adams argued, as Whitehead did, for a unified worldview in which the physical and the psychic were involved in some way in all aspects of the universe. Scientific naturalism begins with dead matter and tries to explain the human. Adams began with human experience and asked what kind of universe could have such capacities. Beyond the foregoing, Adams offered a philosophical anthropology that I find unmatched. The philosophies of Whitehead and Adams, as well as the work of Berry, have a bearing on what I will say about worldviews for ecological civilization. So let's begin with values for an ecological civilization. I have two primary offerings in the area of values. One concerns the meaning of ecological civilization, and the other a set of values for an ecological civilization. There are values that in principle don't have a historical context. For example, always tell the truth in principle applies to any historical period. In philosophy, these are referred to as virtues or eternal, that is to say, timeless values. There is a role for virtues and virtue ethics, but that's not the kind of values I will discuss here. I will discuss values needed in a new stage of civilization, ecological civilization. Note I said stage of civilization. I did so for ease of expression, but stage is a term somewhat at odds with ecological civilization. Stage is a static term. Ecological civilization is a dynamic, processual, ever-evolving reality. To talk about ecological civilization is to understand we are in a historical transition, and to understand this transition fully is to know we will always be in transition. Ecological civilization is not something to be arrived at, but something ever to be created. Indeed, in this conference, we are involved in the process of creating it. This transition has a macro or overreaching aspect, and it has a micro aspect. The macro aspect concerns the cumulative transition. The micro concerns the particular actions that bring it about. The conscious awareness of ecological civilization begins with the macro. Paul Raskin of the Tellus Institute writes that we are in the planetary phase of civilization, and he's correct. Thomas Berry wrote that from the earliest times in human history, we have been acculturated into a microphase awareness of our places in the Earth system. Yet we find ourselves now at a place where humans as a whole have a macrophase impact. Ecological civilization depends on this macrophase awareness. Thomas Berry, I believe, offered the most radical assessment of the macro transition. He wrote that we are moving from the terminal Cenozoic era in Earth's history to an emerging Ecozoic era. He wrote this because he believed we may be going through the sixth mass extinction in Earth's history, but even more because he believed that Earth's life systems could no longer function as they did over the last 65 million years of the Cenozoic era. When human arrives on this planet, they truly arrived in a Garden of Eden, fed by fresh streams and air and abundant plant and animal species. Now few rivers have their natural flows. The ocean is acidifying. Toxins and pollutants with very long lifetimes affect ecosystems. Topsoil is eroding. Deserts are spreading. Humans consume more than 50% of Earth's fresh water and biomass, and the climate is warming and changing. There are two possible results of this. One is the increasing degradation of Earth's ecosystems and the decline of large animal species, including humans. And the second is an emerging Ecozoic era, where humans have a conscious relationship with other life and life systems and live in a mutually enhancing way with them and with other humans. Barry gave 14 principles of the Ecozoic era. And by the way, I told Andrew that I'm going to make some of the materials I speak about available through a folder on the website or through Andrew's website. Here's one of his principles I find especially meaningful. He says, number 5, the entire pattern of functioning of Earth is altered in the transition from the Cenozoic era to the Ecozoic era. The major developments of the Cenozoic took place entirely apart from any human intervention. In the Ecozoic, the human will have a comprehensive influence on almost everything that happens. While the humans cannot make a blade of grass, there is liable not to be a blade of grass unless it is accepted, protected, and fostered by the human. Our positive power of creativity in the natural systems is minimal, while our power of negating is immense. I believe the values for ecological civilization must be aligned with Barry's vision of the Ecozoic era. So here's my list of values, and this I'm going to share with you. Give me a moment. Okay. All right, do you see the screen now? Values for an ecological civilization?
Yes.
Top of it.
Okay.
Can you scroll up, Herman? We only see the top bar.
Oh. Uh-oh.
Oh, it appeared for a second and then went away.
Oh, yeah, okay, I know what I need to do. Try this. Does that get it?
Yes, you're there.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Can't read. It's hard to read.
Small.
Can't read it.
But it's there, so it's helpful.
We know it's there.
Oh, well, okay. All right, I'm sorry.
A few people can read it.
2 people can read it. Okay, so, well, I can read it, so that's good. So it's a I forget what you call these, but it's a grid, and one has to do with epistemological, and these are values, but not exactly the values in the way we normally think about them. And for epistemological values, I have a cross going across. I have inclusiveness, interdependence, and appreciation. And then at the bottom, I have a definition of appreciation, which I'll get to in a minute. But epistemological, dealing with inclusiveness in the modern worldview, which we'll also discuss, a lot's left out. I mean, the human becomes an anomaly. In science, it's said that science can tell you how many times a violin string vibrates, but it can't hear the music. So there's all these dimensions of existence which have to be included as a value in the epistemology of the Ecozoic era. The second is interdependence, and that's not to deal with things as isolated, but recognizing that things exist in their interdependence. I like to say that Whitehead says that things exist by virtue of their relationships, and they don't exist outside those relationships. And then another aspect is appreciation. It goes back again to the dimensions by which we grasp our world. So this one I had a hard time finding a word, and this one is lacking in some ways until you look at the definition of appreciate. And it says to recognize the quality, significance, or magnitude of. Second, it says to be fully aware of or sensitive to. Third, it says to be thankful or show gratitude for. And four, it says to admire greatly. And fifth, which is the economic, but it has a meaning here, it says to raise in value or price, especially over time. So our epistemology should have a greater appreciation for the world, a greater sense of the magnitude, significance, a greater sense of qualities of the world, qualitative differences. So the second row is ontological values, and I cheated here. I put in 6, but they go together. Some of you know Barry's work will recognize communion, differentiation, and subjectivity. And I didn't follow that exactly. In fact, I changed it as I was preparing for today. But I have a friend, some of you know his name, Arturo Escobar. He's one of the well-known critics of development. And he talks about ontological politics, that what's involved in the world today isn't simply who has and who has not, but it's about how do we understand the world, that the modern understanding of the world, which we'll talk about in Worldview, is not adequate. So there's a struggle for a more adequate ontology. And so we have to look at our values in terms of what our ontology is, how we understand the very nature of our world. So one is communion, and I also mentioned earlier organism. So communion is a term Thomas Berry uses. Organism is the term that Whitehead uses. The second category is process and creativity, and that's to understand that in our contemporary understanding, we live in an evolutionary, ever-changing universe. And creativity is it's not simply cause and effect relationships. The new comes into being, and then differentiation and subjectivity. But I have to say that the subjectivity is also important because we don't just have exterior physical relationships with the world, we have an interior relationship with the world. And then the ethical, moving from individualism and rights and so forth, is beginning with an ethics of responsibility that's grounded in, and you go back up to the ones above it, inclusiveness and community and organism. So it's an ethics of responsibility. And then in the middle is an ethics of adaptability and resilience. So this is, I mean, when you have a world, we have a world where we believe that coastlines will always stay where they are, rivers will always stay where they are, landscapes will always stay where they are. It's not the way it is. We have to develop an ability to be adaptable and resilient. And the last is equally important, and it's sensitivity, because we can't ignore anything. Really, it goes back to the epistemological inclusiveness, but it's a particular kind of inclusiveness. It's sensitivity, it's awareness, it's being open to the world that we have. So that's my one slide, and I'll go back to my text. So let's see how I get back to the text. Okay, working my way. All right, so that's the values. So the worldview. Andrew, where am I on time? I've sort of lost 2 minutes left.
Yep.
I'll give him some more.
All right. Well,
Let's give him.
We'll give you 4 minutes. That leaves only one question for afterward.
all right. Well, All right, so now I'm at a loss for words. Okay, so it's common to talk about worldviews, and I recognize the value of the concept, but I want to first criticize the term. And I think a more meaningful term than worldview is cosmology. One's worldview is one's understanding of the world in a larger sense of the universe, and that's cosmology. In the modern period, cosmology has largely been reduced to physical cosmology, the kind of work scientists do. Classically, though, cosmology was part of the branch of philosophy known as metaphysics. This kind of cosmology, that is to say, philosophical cosmology, concerns the basic assumptions we make about the nature of the universe and the human role in it that inform our investigations of the world and our actions and can't be proven or disproven by empirical observations alone. Now I'm going to skip all the way to the end of my talk. And I told Andrew that I would send this talk, so if you want a copy of it, want to see what you're missing, and you'll have it. It'll also be in this folder that will be available by contacting me at hfgreenenc@gmail.com. I talk about how in the modern period that it's an acosmic period because the world isn't seen as having a logos or order or meaning or value, and how worldviews then are relativized. One's as good as another because the universe, the cosmos, doesn't validate any. And then I argue to a certain extent against the concept of worldviews, the relativistic worldviews, and the need to reinstate a sense of cosmos, a shared cosmos. And I say that I think that's possible, but it's not an easy task. And if you'll bear with me for one moment, I have a couple of paragraphs to finish with. So it's not an easy task. It goes against modern science and philosophy. It is, however, happening through the work of Berry, Whitehead, Adams, and related thinkers. Thomas Berry has led an effort to develop a new story that restores a cosmos. He framed his new story in terms of our new universe story, the scientific story of an evolving universe. Berry focused on the narrative dimensions of this. Whitehead took a similar starting point in science, and he focused on the organic nature of the world and its processes, and thus opened a way to bridge the humanities and sciences. Brogg, I didn't read the part about Remy Brogg, his book on the universe and Western thought, but he talked about how cosmology involves the philosophical anthropology, and I talk about Adams as contributing that. And I conclude, postmodern deconstructionists criticize meta worldviews, and they would do so even if they were called cosmologies. They feel they are colonizing on our exercises of power. There is that danger, but an even greater danger arises from the globalized acosmic worldview of modernity. In its place is needed a globalized new cosmology of the type briefly described above, which rather than denying traditional cosmologies as the modern worldview does, it allows them to come alive in a new way. In conclusion, I know that people will still talk about worldviews as good things without recognizing how modernity has relativized them. And I certainly don't want to attempt to interject this interpretation when I hear the term used. For us today, however, let us be aware of the need for a new shared cosmology. It's part of building an ecological civilization, and within that new cosmology, may 10,000 worldviews flourish. That's the end.
Thank you very much, Herman. We have, let's see, like 2 minutes for questions. We'll dig into our break time a little bit because we really want to engage, but that means 1-sentence questions, 2-sentence responses. Good luck.
Okay.
Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Herman. My question is that, I too have read the Universe Story. I think it's a profound book. And so my question is that because of its profundity, what is a way to make it relatable, something like the universe story and this type of deep cosmology, mythology that we can all relate to in the universe. How do we relate to it to kind of bring it down, to use it in our new ecological vision moving forward? What's like a tangible way that we could kind of frame that?
2 sentences.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is actually, 2 sentences. I mean, as you may know, Brian Swimme and Mary Evelyn Tucker with the Journey of the Universe have attempted to do that. I'm feel that it's too soon to have a single narrative. I don't see it that way. I think it's something that will have to develop over a long period of time. And but part of it is understanding the history of Earth. It's partly understanding the history of the universe, but especially the Earth, how we went from life 4.5 billion years ago to multicelled animals 750 million years ago to the Cambrian explosion and so forth. We don't really know the history of our Earth, and so it's hard for us to know our place in it. So the short answer I would say is, there is the narrative aspect, and I think that should be expressed through poetry and drama and film and so forth. But then there's the other area of ecological literacy, which is another way of learning the universal story.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just wondered if you mentioned the coming of an Ecozoic era, but there's a lot of conversation now and talk now about the Anthropocene, and the Geological Society is determining whether we have now left the Holocene and are into the Anthropocene. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Sure, I have a lot of thoughts about that. I also have a very good paper that I'll include in this folder, which is a history of the attempts to name the age of man or the age of the human. It goes back over 150 years. So in terms of geology, they use stratigraphy and they look at what is the life force that's most shaping that period. And so I think the Anthropocene epoch is a good name for this. Anthropocene is descriptive. It points at the same reality to a certain extent, that humans are more than a biological species. They're a geological force on Earth. And this is what we need to understand. The Ecozoic is normative. It's something yet to be realized. The Anthropocene is descriptive.
Okay, thank you.
It's actually a great way to end. Thank you so much, Herman, for your time. This will be really helpful in guiding our discussion over the rest of today and tomorrow.
Okay, very good. Thanks.